All right, I'm going to hand this off to Natasha Leonard to start our next panel.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Nathan. Can everyone hear me? Is this working? Yep. So, hi, welcome to Where Truth Lies, a brilliantly named panel. Sounds like a Harrison Ford movie, which is not what we'll be discussing. I'm Natasha Leonard. I'm a writer about political things for places like Esquire and The Nation and various outlets. And we're going to be talking about truth and post-truth and the alleged crisis of it. So just as a brief introduction before I introduce you to my panelists, this year, some of you might remember, the New York Times ran its first ever Oscars ad, an ad during the Oscars ceremony. And it was pushing something I'm sure they never thought they'd have to peddle, which is truth. And it was this string of sentences that is kind of like God is love. The truth is hard. The truth is hidden. The truth is necessary. The truth can't be glossed over, and so on, nonsense. And it was, of course, one of many mainstream liberal responses to this current so-called truth crisis that came with Trump's ascendancy. And the kind of issue at hand, of course, is a moment where lies and falsehood abound from both the White House and popular news institutions with serious political consequence. Conspiracies and contradictions are crystallized as political reality. Pollsters don't even know the mark they're missing. And social media technologies infuse with crack consensus realities that make for incommensurable narratives. And liberals are left sort of shell-shocked by their all-too-late realization that some metaphysical capital T truth isn't functioning as a corrective power. But truth is a failing tactic. The Times carries on. The truth has no agenda. The truth can't be manufactured, displaying exactly the grand ideological misunderstanding of what truth maybe ever was. And so what, in fact, is under threat in these mendacious time. And so this is what we're going to talk about. My panelists are the excellent Jay Rosen next to me, who teaches journalism at New York University. He's the author of PressThink.org, a blog about journalism's ordeals in the age of the web. In 1999, Yale University Press published his book, What Are Journalists For? A very good question. We also have, next to Jay, Aaron Cantu, a journalist and activist in New York City, and he's senior editor at the excellent New Inquiry. We then have Tara Isabella Burton, who has written on religion and culture for the Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, The Telegraph, Aeon, is that how you say it? The American Interest, and more. She's finishing a DPhil in theology at Oxford. And Alexa O'Brien researches and writes about national security and capital crimes. So we're just going to begin with each panelist talking for 5 minutes around and about this topic, and then we're going to launch into a discussion. And then after a bit of that, when you're bored of hearing from us, you can make noises, and we will make noises back. So I think Jay is going to begin for us.
Thank you very much, Natasha. First, I'd like to express my appreciation for the organizers of Theorizing the Web, which is a brilliant idea, I think, and a much needed space. And I want to thank you for asking me to participate. It also makes me a little nervous to be here with you. Ordinarily, I speak to groups of journalists, journalism teachers, students, or people who are worried about the health of the mainstream press. And my usual concern is being a little bit too radical or too much of a critic of journalism. And with this crowd, like you people, I'm looking at you right now, might be a little bit too mainstream for your taste, but, or just like lame, but I'm gonna try to get pushed through that. To give you a sense of what I mean, I've been teaching journalism at NYU for 30 years, and during that time, I've never had a faculty member or a student say to me, we need a little more theory in our curriculum. Like, could you give us a little more theory? Like, the only demand I've ever received from journalism students is for a practical education. And I think that's important to contemplate in a conference like this, because American journalism as a practice is hostile to theory. It is hostile to philosophical questions about truth, power, justice, equality. It is in several ways that it doesn't acknowledge anti-intellectual. And this makes it difficult to have a conversation with our journalists about the sorts of questions that this panel is about. Many times the answers that you get to very profound questions of truth, power, difference, distinction, the answers that journalists would give back to you are inane. They're like, they have no content. They're not even worth discussing. And that, it's not an accident. It's part of how this profession operates. During the 70s and 80s, enormously valuable literature was created by social scientists who went into American newsrooms to study what goes on there. These were not journalists, but sociologists, anthropologists, people who studied organizational behavior. And they went into American newsrooms and they spent months there, and they interviewed people and they watched how journalists work. And one of the things they concluded was that most of the time what journalists are doing is they're accommodating themselves to a production routine that is completely unforgiving. Meaning, if you are a journalist at a daily newspaper or a news broadcast, you have to have something ready by the time the deadline occurs. It doesn't matter if you don't know what you're talking about. It doesn't matter if you didn't do enough research. It doesn't matter if you couldn't answer the important questions. You still have to produce a text. You have to produce a story. And so most of what journalists do is not actually negotiate questions of truth or justice or accuracy or balance. Most of the time, they're just accommodating themselves to a production routine. But if you ask them what they're doing, they give you these answers like story and justice and fourth estate and adversarial press, and so they have a hard time understanding what they're actually doing. So it's very important for this group to understand that American journalists are hostile to theory. They're hostile to you. Okay. Now, that means that the press is in many ways insulated from the debates that have gone on in the university for decades. There's a vast gulf between the conversation that happens in mainstream journalism circles about their work and the conversation that happens at conferences like this. So I'll conclude with one thought for you. Alongside the production of news, mainstream journalists are constantly engaged in another manufacture, which is the production of their own innocence. What I mean by innocence is we're not involved in the debates between left and right. We're not participants in political debate. We don't have an ideology. We don't have a philosophy. We don't have any assumptions. We're not starting from any place. We're just telling you the way it is, so you should believe us for that reason, because we don't have an assumption. We don't have a philosophy. We don't have an ideology. And this demonstration that we're not ideologues, we're just telling you the way it is, and we're innocent of politics, is something that doesn't happen once, like in a code of ethics or a mission statement. It has to be reproduced continuously. So that's what he said, she said journalism is about. That's what the fairness bias is about. And that's what Nicholas Kristof last night on Lawrence O'Brien saying, I don't agree with Donald Trump, but actually I think this was a great idea to bomb Syria. You know, that's what he's about, because he's trying to demonstrate that he's not too far to the left, too far to the right, and right down the middle. So that's part of how the profession of journalism keeps all of these questions like theorizing the web at bay. So to sum up, American journalism is hostile to theory and hostile to you.
Thank you. An excellent beginning. Exactly where I wanted this to start. Brilliant. Okay. We're going to move on, and our next panelist to hopefully explain some more hostilities and conflicts is Tara. So can I ask you to start?
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to start sort of counterintuitively for a conference entitled Theorizing the Web by talking about something that happened in the late 19th century with about a man called Leo Taxil. Now, Leo Taxil was which was not his real name, was in many things. He was a forger, he was a con artist, and he managed throughout the end of the 19th century, so the 1890s, to convince just about everybody in the mainstream media and the Catholic Church about the existence of a group of Freemasons in America that were so diabolical and so terrible. They were involved in sort of various sacrifices and sex orgies and all sorts of, everything that you can possibly imagine. They did it. And he had a beautiful young woman, Diana Vaughan, tell all these stories and write these memoirs about her awful time when she was being raised to be the next goddess in this institution, so on and so forth. He ends up meeting with the Pope to discuss this. And this all becomes this sort of major scandal that's played out in the French press during the time. And he finally calls a press conference in 1897. And he says, I'm going to unmask. Diana Vaughan is going to come and speak to you about her awful experiences of torture and black masses and what have you. And he gets up there, and every representative of every French paper is there. And he basically gets up and says, fooled you. And we actually have the records of this because the transcripts of this were published. And he goes on this long rant. He basically says, you made me what I am. This started as a joke, but this, you believed it, you fed this, you wanted it, you got it. And this was the Taxil hoax. Interestingly enough, Jack Chick, the Christian Evangelical Tracts, still reproduce some of this material to talk about Freemasons. So if you ever find a Chick tract, it will talk about, it will give you data that Leo Taxil himself wrote as a hoax, as an admitted hoax. But what I find so interesting about the story, and just to caveat, my doctoral work is in the theology of late 19th century France, so I'm a little biased there. But what I think is so fascinating about the story is it exists at the intersection of new media, or what was then new media, a kind of celebrity press, questions of religion, questions of faith, questions of conspiracy, and how kind of in another time where the ramifications of new technology and new ways of being and new ways of creating oneself were uncertain and undefined, it created a vacuum where essentially all of these different cultural forces were able to come together in this moment where sort of we created something sort of a proto-post-truth, as it were. And my interest today, as we talk about the internet now, is to look at another time which is not actually so different. We're talking about a different technology, a different medium for the conveyance of truth, for the conveyance of fiction, for the conveyance of that which lies between the two. But ultimately, I think the difference is one of sort of degree and medium, not of kind. And it's my hope that by talking about the late 19th century and kind of some of the factors there, that we might have a theory of the web that's not simply about what is this new thing and how does it work, but how do different cultural moments and different cultural crises and questions, when we have new avenues for expressing ourselves, resolve themselves on these new stages.
Excellent, thank you. And we're gonna then turn to Aaron for his thoughts.
Hey, Yeah, so I guess leaving off on that point, I will say what I was going to say, but backwards, because it kind of fits into your point about how people come to define themselves in relation to new technology at certain points, and the sort of ideological crises that they come out of, and ideological vacuums as well, power vacuums as well. So I had brought up some websites because what I noticed was in the last few months since the election, there have been different groups online who have really just put in a lot of work into. So I was kind of interested in like different sort of ways that groups see salient identities within themselves, and then put a lot of money and resources into building and pushing out a narrative that is favorable to that part of their identity that they see as most salient. And so the first one is Blue Lives Matter. So I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the hashtag and the movement, but it's actually a thing. It's a nonprofit organization, and you know their main thing is a news website. You know, I mean they keep up with whenever different officers are hurt, or whenever the mainstream media is being biased against cops, and that's their sort of thing, right? Another example that I thought was interesting was the Wall Street Journal has recently started to put out. And I won't play this, but they've started to put out little stories and narratives about journalists who work for the Wall Street Journal, and it's The Face of Real News is the name of the series, and the narrative there is meant to it's meant to bolster and present these journalists in a positive light, while Donald Trump and others are attempting to denigrate them. Another, I guess, like subcultural identity group that I saw was like really investing a lot more time and resources into their media and narrative formation is I guess this anarchist group that runs this media collective called Submedia. And so they had, for a decade, they had a particular format they did things through, and they recently just invested a lot of money in this new website. It's very slick. They have 30-minute long mini documentaries. And last is, this is where in South Texas, people who live along the border started this news website. It's news / entertainment, and these are young people of leftist persuasions who live along the southern border, who felt compelled to make this website and sort of push out their own narrative. So I think it's interesting that all of these things have really happened since the election, and the question of what it means for how people are attempting to fill this vacuum that I think was revealed to exist after, or at least in mainstream consciousness after the election. And so I wrote a piece recently that looked at the way that the mainstream media attempted to use fake news as a way to shore up their own legitimacy, and especially in the weeks and months after the election. There was everything was sort of fake news. Things that I think would have normally been described as disinformation or just rumor, or everything sort of became fake news, and it became clear that the mainstream media was attempting to define itself in relation to this phenomenon that seemed as a convenient scapegoat to explain what happened in the election and how they were able to get it so wrong. So I think that was, it was a scapegoat, and it was a form of deflection. And then my essay also looked at, essentially that Donald Trump coming to power and the mainstream media having to confront this new right-wing narrative reveals that, the mainstream media isn't objective or neutral, because there is no objectivity or neutrality. It's a material world in which, power matters. The resources that you have to confirm your version of the truth. And so, just to wrap it up, I was interested in different ways that hyper-rich people were using and weaponizing fake news against the media, which I think was able to happen because the mainstream media underestimated or overestimated the confidence that they had with the public. So you had people like Ray Dalio, who is the owner of the largest hedge fund in the world, who he took issue with an article that was critical of him and called it fake news. And it sort of just revealed that the argument and discussion over fake news is ultimately about narrative, and I think that that explains, why we're seeing such investment and all of these different subcultural groups online in pushing out different narratives, because there's this vacuum that exists, and I think that that's the deeper truth in how we, what we call fake news is really just a battle over narrative.
Excellent. And finally, for this little part, Alexa.
That was really good, really interesting. Everybody, it's a lot of fun to listen to you guys. So I'm going to make three sort of general points that arise in my mind when I think about the issue of post-truth or theorizing the web. My initial sort of reaction to the phenomenon that was discussed, just now is that part of this is an ancient problem. It kind of reminds me of Plato's Gorgias, where Socrates interrogates sophistry, or the art of persuasion. And in ancient Athens, powerful families would send their young men to be trained by these sophists. And so perhaps when we speak about, partly when we speak about the truth, we're speaking about a type of consensus. Now, that consensus could be, have the character of like peer review, whether it's for a narrative or for science. This sense of an egalitarian or meritorious conversation where we discuss ideas and vet out the bad ones and sort of parse it all down to what we can all sort of agree is something of a ground, or could be a ground. But then there's also the idea of consensus in terms of being able to persuade other people to do what you want. And there is something, what's the right word? There's something hypnotizing or attractive about the power of persuasion. I mean, you go onto Twitter, and oftentimes it seems that what's considered to be the most popular is often taken as truth, as if the truth and popularity have a relationship with each other that is inherent. So the second point I want to make is that, just to sort of interrogate our ideas around this, or raise some questions about what we mean when we use these kinds of terms, is the truth, at least in my experience and my layman's review of history, is often not popular, or it cannot be popular. I think about covering the Manning trial, and it was fake news that Manning released top secret material. And this actually directly led to her pretrial confinement in Kuwait, and then also at Quantico, where she was stripped of her underwear and forced to stand naked at attention, and which caused great controversy within some circles. But it seemed to me, at least from my own perspective, that most of the people just assumed that was the truth. So there are incidences like that. So the other sort of aspect of like the truth is really popular is that you'll have groupings, like even sort of the alternative media, like where I come out of, like the internet journalists, who we have in trying to negotiate. Let me take a step back. It seems to me that 80% of the work that oftentimes less mainstream groups have to expend is in actually getting into the conversation. Right? So you can't even have the conversation because, the trickery or spin or whatever to have a sort of egalitarian conversation, right? So in some regards, when you become invested in the outlets like WikiLeaks or other alternative outlets that propose to be this kind of vehicle through which you get power, one of the dangers of not continually interrogating that relationship is that a lot of these groups ultimately become infiltrated, whether it's by another intelligence service or their own intelligence service, or they get utilized. That there are powers that are basically invested in you and me not having a conversation. So no one owns the truth. Everybody can be used for somebody else's end. So my final point sort of relates to the theme of this particular panel, of theorizing the web. I get the sense that the internet has a relationship with conspiracy that is somewhat unique. It's not that conspiracy is unique, right? It's not that gossip is unique. But from just reflecting on it, and I don't know the answer of, what it is. I mean, this would require like some methodical thinking, but I get the sense that part of it is an economy of scale, right? I remember in the early 2000s, an Indiana professor did a lot of studies about the relationship between identity and the internet. And in the Manning trial, for example, the Department of Defense, after Manning leaked the material and was arrested, they did their own investigation into how the hell she got a security clearance and what the hell happened there. And in this study, this is called the Secretary of the Army study, you can find it online, they talk about, as a heavy social capital organization with a very strict hierarchy, how the younger soldiers seem to have an affinity online that's different than the affinity they have in like real life. That the internet does stretch our identity. There's an expressive quality. Entertainment, maybe it's because we're mediated. So there's something about that. But also, I remember even before this election, like with Sandy Hook in 2012, I remember watching Anderson Cooper at some rest stop in between like New York and Fort Meade, discussing how, like, what is it with the internet and its ability to sort of spread these conspiracy theories about the shooters that was coming about. And even before that, I remember in 2005 watching Lost. Remember the television show? It was the first... Well, you should totally see it, okay? I remember watching the show in the first season, like, oh my God, the Dharma Initiative, like all this stuff, right? And then suddenly I started seeing online these fake websites for like the Dharma Initiative. And I always thought that show kind of lost out on like how far down the rabbit hole you could go, like with the internet and a TV show like that. But which brings me to sort of my like last point, is that there is a cultural characteristic on the internet of cunning. And part of it's part of that projection of identity. Like, look at me riding a horse, or here I am in Chile being an explorer. Whatever it is that we project onto our social media pages, or, about our politics, about our identity, etc. And I remember in 2012, Clapper speaking before the Senate Armed Services Committee about how leaks are dangerous to U.S. national security because essentially what it does is it chills communications between spooks. It chills information sharing amongst spooks. Now, typically that word chills applies to the First Amendment, the public not being able to actually discuss things. So there is, and with hybrid warfare, and you see this sort of morphing, there is this kind of trickery. Okay, so I venture to say that this is kind of somewhat, that sort of sensibility is somewhat, a regurgitation of stuff that happened, like when Senator Moynihan wrote a book called Secrecy, and he talked about, the desperation of the FOIA person. It's like they're like looking for some kind of, in the heightened state of too much secrecy, of overclassification, of a lack of ability to vet information, how it affected policy. It produces bad policy. And one of the things he talked about is that in that state, you have this, what was referred to earlier, this sort of tendency towards revisionist history. That the government is out to get me, that I'm being surveilled by covering the Manning trial. All the kind of, the fashionableness of paranoia, which could be true. I mean, who knows what's going on, right? I'm not trying to, that's not the discussion we're having right now. But there is a quality about that has affected also our subcultures and our alternative groups. And so I think that there's something there that I'm curious about and would like to sort of explore.
Well, thank you all. So the way we're going to do this now is I'm going to ask actually questions to all of you, and you can jump in, and then I can direct you to talk to each other. And just to trace some of the themes I'm seeing connect what you guys are saying is questions of newness or repetition, and in ways sort of, is a lot of this panic now a panic about the perception of the internet as some aperture of a different type of paranoia, a different type of relationship to selves and truths. So I want to talk a little bit about those technologies and the way they've existed in different shifts in the past. I also want to talk about entertainment and affect, as Alexa brought up, and how those connect. And then I think we can get a little bit more into material conditions and formations of journalistic and social media narratives. But I would love to start off by talking about this issue of newness and this panic around new technologies as the guiding principle of a post-truth, and how much you guys think that's a relevant statement and question, and where it's flawed. And I think, Tara, you're a good person to start there.
Yes. So I come down the side that it's not new. So that's where I am in the debate. And my particular interest in the internet is first and foremost as an avenue for self-creation. One of the sort of the main comparison I draw and that I have been drawing is to the late 19th century Paris and to the city. And I think actually the city and the city as public space is the sort of previous analog that we can find here. So a sort of fun random fact is that in 19th century Paris, gaslighting became a thing. So and over the course of about 50 years in the second half of the 19th century, we went from a few gaslights to hundreds, thousands of gaslights. I don't recall the exact numbers, all through the streets of Paris. Which basically meant that public space, public urban space, went from sort of this thing you have to deal with to get through A and B, get from place A to place B, that you have to kind of hope that you don't get mugged and hope that nothing horrible is going to happen to you. Around the same time, of course, we have a Haussmann and the development of boulevards. So suddenly you're walking down these wide streets and cafes are developing, and you can sit at the café terrasse and you can look out. And suddenly there is, and this is not the only time this has happened in history, but this is, I think, a particularly paradigmatic example. There is a new way of being that means that suddenly when you are out in public, you are watching, you are being watched, you are performing. The cultural figure of the flaneur, or the people watcher, developed at this time, someone who would sort of sit at the café terrasse or wander anonymously through the crowd and watch everybody. Baudelaire writes about how he's a prince who's everywhere incognito. At the same time, the other figure is the dandy, also a figure of Baudelaire, and Barbie d'Aurevilly wrote about him, who's not simply someone who is well dressed, but someone whose life is a performance, who's a miniature god, he is called, or someone who has a cult of originality. So all of these sort of cultural phenomena grew out of new space to be oneself. At the same time, another sort of element that I think is vital to this conversation, and this reflects my bias, I'm a theologian, is the question of religion. In the late 19th century Paris, and France more generally, and Europe more generally, et cetera, was this time of absolute crisis, a question of, who are we when we create ourselves? What does that mean to create ourselves? What does that mean to be ourselves if, God hasn't made us, if there isn't something kind of about us that is rooted in a question of the soul, like who are we really? And I think that question, which is less a question of does God exist and more a question of narrative, of what do things mean? What do we mean? What do the cultural symbols around us, are their meanings arbitrary or ontological? Those are questions I think we see very much today. I'd argue, and I've written for Real Life and other places about the religious dimension of, for example, groups like the alt-right and sort of discourse about meme magic and Keck being rooted in a kind of not occult discourse in the sense of belief, but in a sense of seeking to create a cosmic narrative of meaning, however ironically or semi-ironically, and that's something we'll get into later, of what it means to kind of create one's narrative around oneself. So I think all of these questions are not at all new, but I do think that the internet has allowed for their proliferation and their intensification and a kind of snowball effect, where we're dealing with, like the boulevard, like the café terrasse, a new space where we can create ourselves, even as the existence of that space, the development of technology more generally, wider cultural and theological questions about who we are and what things mean and what grounds truth, allow for a degree of anarchy and instability in that sphere.
So yes, just to speak to that, and I'm wondering actually if Aaron might want to jump in there, because as you say, with a sort of, in the same way with the 17th century, 16th century, there was perhaps a void in, semiotics with the death of God. A recognition of the death of metaphysical truth seems to have created this void, as you say, and there are these meme narratives that step in and a certain religiosity to them. But it's not arbitrary and it's not an open-ended thing, right? Some people's narratives win and some are less good. And I feel like, Aaron, you were touching a little bit on the sort of power dynamics as to how and why in this landscape, in this social media online landscape, certain narratives get to win through in these competing consensus reality games.
Yeah, so to, I guess, like build on the essay that I had written, I read some Gramsci secondhand, and I'm not a political theorist in any way. I'm a journalist, but so I'm sorry if I, misquote Gramsci. But it did help to clarify the so his theory of hegemonic narratives and a hegemonic ruling power will always have an advantage in reproducing its dominant narratives of society, which principally functions to reproduce the material conditions of society, which are, of course, in the interests of the ruling class. And any narrative that would attempt to counter the dominating narrative, which would come from what he called the subaltern class, would have a difficult time because the dominant narrative already is well resourced. It's backed by money and different avenues and channels of information dissemination, and it's also backed by common sense, which is something that's just so calcified in the public consciousness that most people don't even question where those basic assumptions come from. So it's very hard for people who don't have that kind of power, who are trying to build an alternative narrative to the hegemonic narrative, to even form the narratives such that it can be allowed to grow in opposition to the dominant narrative. So reading those ideas was clarifying for me. When I think about the example that you brought up from the 19th century in France, I do agree that these kinds of public performances and what that means for how we, not only how we display our identities, but how we self-define ourselves in relation to other people. I do agree that that process is not necessarily new, but then I also consider that if we're mostly talking about Facebook, which is probably the most accessible and widely used social media medium, it's a private company, and anything you do and say on there is immediately commodified and is the property of Facebook. I would assume that in the 19th century, these were public places and public streets where theoretically your actions and gestures, which I think were done to affirm this kind of identity that you wanted to have affirmed, or that must be affirmed by others' perception of you, wasn't a commodity necessarily. It wasn't immediately something that could be bought and sold to advertisers. And so then in terms of the ways that certain narratives are bolstered over others, Facebook made tens of millions of dollars off of the Donald Trump campaign. And I remember during the election also seeing Trump advertisements a lot in my newsfeed. And so I think this medium through which people are expressing themselves and doing this sort of in-group confirmation and affirmation amongst peers, we have to consider that it's happening in this privatized context in which everything you do and say is immediately a commodity. And when you do something in a world like that, it means that money and resources are going to play a significant role. And I think with the election of Trump and the way that the Trump campaign was able to, its digital strategy, that it was able to leverage that need to affirm one's identity and to be part of a group, I think just goes to show that it's different. While these kinds of performances and the reasons that they're done in order to affirm yourself as part of a group. While they may have been done in history, I think the fact that it's happening in such a privatized way now is significant.
And Jay, I'm sort of curious about your thoughts on the perception of the newness in this phenomena and what is actually potentially new in your view. Okay, we're sharing.
Well, I've been discussing my ideas online since 1996, so it's 21 years. And one of the first things I learned is never call anything new. Because if you do, you're going to be immediately contradicted by somebody who knows more than you do. So don't do that. Yeah. However, it is more productive to contrast what's different about today from a previous era. So to come back to our general theme here of theorizing the web, for me as a student of journalism, student of news, one of the most important thing that's different about the internet as a way of communicating and producing news and distributing news is that during the age of mass media, which actually lasted a very long time, from late 19th century all the way through to 1994 or so, what became normalized for the producers of news was an image of the audience, the people out there, the public, as connected up to hierarchies, to power, to the White House, to the state, and disconnected from one another. So the whole idea of a mass audience is people on the receiving end of the media who are reached in their private locations, whether it's the home or the car when they're listening to the radio, or the breakfast table when they're reading the newspaper, who are connected up to power, to media, to the state, and disconnected or atomized from one another. And that image of the audience sunk very deeply into the creators of mass media, so deeply that they didn't consider it an image or an assumption at all, but just the nature of things. And one of the most striking and powerful things about the internet is that it's just as good at connecting people horizontally to one another as it is to connecting them vertically to the powers that be. And so during the age of the internet, journalists began to realize that people could organize themselves into communities of interest without their intervention at all, which was not a new thing, but different compared to the age of mass media. And one of the most powerful things about the age of the internet is the falling costs for like-minded people to locate each other, realize their number, find representatives of their point of view, share information, and kind of assert themselves on the public stage. In an age of mass media, everybody's atomized. It's very difficult for them to locate each other because they're connected up, but they're disconnected across. So even the teenage girl who's watching the Oscars and then talking to her friends at the same time is experiencing like the erasure of mass media conditions. So one of the things that explains the freak out of our mainstream journalists at the rise of the web is that they had assumed that their people on the receiving end were connected to them but disconnected from one another. And in reality now, people are still connected up. They're connected to the White House. They can go from their home to whitehouse.gov. They can go to CNN.com. But they're also connected to one another. They can form groups And one of the things they realize when they can connect with one another is how much they hate the media, you know, and how dissatisfied they are with the portrait that they've been receiving. Whereas before, under atomized conditions, that was very difficult for them to understand, and they couldn't do that. So I'm not saying that's new, because if you say something's new, you're taking your life in your hands on the internet. But it's different. It's different than the age that preceded it.
Yes, please jump in.
One of the things that I thought was so interesting listening to your language, Jay, is that so much of the sort of way in which you described this sort of change and from mass media to this atomization is language that I think could kind of be applied more generally and more theoretically to questions of sort of metaphysical truth, insofar as you talk about even though the powers that be, which is sort of obviously quite a common phrase, but the idea of this kind of vertical motion and the sort of lack of kind of ontological trust up, as it were, in favor of a more horizontal movement towards sort of, I am less inclined to kind of trust the powers that be or get my news from the powers that be, and instead I am in kind of processing the news and kind of processing information and then refiguring it through conversation, doing that with others. That is, so obviously I'm biased in my own academic background, but I think that there's a kind of religious element to that. And by this, I do not absolutely mean belief or metaphysical proposition, but I mean kind of how religions function ultimately is a question of, regardless of the metaphysics of it, it's a question of understanding meaning and ascribing meaning, understanding and ascribing a narrative to the world, and also expressing and reiterating identity, which is something that you yourself said, to the point where, I would argue, and I would make the case for this, that whether we're talking about the alt-right or any other kind of community, that we are talking about something that functions as a religion, regardless, again, of belief. This idea that, whether it's we virtue signal on Facebook, whether we communicate with each other, what we're doing often a lot of the time is less sharing individual propositional accounts, this thing happened today, but more expressing who we are. Like, I share this article that sort of shows who I am, and you, by liking it, kind of agree with the principle of the article, and maybe it's not about the article at all, whether it's something about Pizzagate is really a statement about, like, we don't trust this and we don't trust Hillary and we are these kind of people. And so the way in which we communicate with each other through the dissemination of information is, I think, itself made possible in the same way that kind of the proliferation of sort of smaller religious and non-theistic movements is made possible by a kind of wider cultural secularism. I think so too does the distrust, sort of our wider distrust in a single authority, which itself is rooted in a distrust of like a particular notion of single truth, allow for a wider dissemination of kind of who we are and an exploration of that.
And I think that's really interesting. And just hit. It's fine. Fake computer. It's just a prop. I want to continue on that, and I think it connects to what Alexa was saying about conspiracy. So I'd also love to trace back a little bit, because I know you have discussed memes, and memes making is myth making in some of your writing. So I think that connects very much to a sort of symbolisms of these fragmented groups that can connect horizontally, and the sort of symbols that enable that, and the way that works in the technologies we have, Pepe avatars. So I'd love to first ask Alexa how she feels this sort of fragmentation and rhizomatic connectivity through social medias can fuel the kind of conspiracy theories you were talking about, and the fogs of more, and then maybe trace back to how memes function in this landscape.
I can actually do that, and Tara's work is really, just talking with her, is really, really interesting. The sort of religious or erotic, what Plato would call the erotic sensibility of belief. But I want to kind of just ground it a little bit and talk about something that's, it's kind of obvious, but we should probably say it, that, the information age led to also an economic shift that has occurred in the United States, for example, over the last 20, 30 years, specifically where regions have split along class lines. That's the thesis of an urban planner named Richard Florida, which, I mean, some people like him, some people don't, but he's done some interesting stuff. His book, The Rise of the Creative Class. And in the erosion of heavy social capital, unions, I think 5%, 2%, a small percentage of the private sector is unionized, 11% of the federal sector is unionized. Churches are the things that people would rely to as what Jay had talked about, affinity groups. Those have existed before, where we have a situation now where people are aggregating, they have a lot of weak social ties. What's my Facebook profile? It's like everyone I've known since kindergarten, okay? Like, I'm able to invest in a lot of small portions of time with a larger group of people. Plus, if I'm working, a lot, so if I even have time to have those kinds of meaningful relationships, is a question. And people aggregate. Where do they aggregate? They aggregate around content, online. In terms of like the Manning release is something that I was sort of watching up close. They aggregated around the cables, or they aggregated with Occupy Wall Street around certain kind of slogans. So coming to this, that kind of dovetails it in with the rise of also what's called the experience economy. This idea of, it's a sort of privileged idea, but it's this sort of sensibility of like living one's life to the fullest, or buying experiences, like traveling to Southeast Asia, or being a revolutionary, or whatever. It comes in many, many forms. So I think that segues right into your sort of notion of trolls and how people...
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you brought up sort of the idea of being a revolutionary as a kind of thing that you can perform, because something that I find particularly interesting in wider questions about self-creation and the internet and performance is the idea of sort of like the self-creation with regards to narrative. And obviously, for me, that is a religious act, insofar as I think any act of self-creation is also an act of saying, like, this is who I am in the world, this is the story I am telling. That is, and this is what I argued in my piece for Real Life, what makes a lot of the sort of alt-right narrative so powerful. It ties into these incredibly powerful cosmic notions of sort of destruction and the end of days, or that proverb, may you live in interesting times, is kind of sexy because it basically says, if we do, like, we matter, this matters. And that is absolutely something that I think is kind of central to the personal narrative, is the idea of being in dialogue with an important cosmic narrative. So if you are a soldier who falls in the meme wars, that's kind of like the ideal sweet spot, because on the one hand, you are engaging with like the coolest thing ever, which is you are part of like a huge movement and an idea, and it's the death of the gods, and this humanity is crashing all around you. That's so sexy and exciting, but also you don't really have to do that much. So it's just like the perfect intersection of like religious narrative and that is actionable, so to the extent that like you can do a thing and it will be part of that, and it'll be participatory, and it'll sort of allow you to be in the community, but it doesn't require that much of you. So that kind of thing, or like being a revolution, like you can perform revolutionary on the internet in a way that...
Yeah, one of the other, it's something I've noticed in line with what you just said. I've also sort of noticed this like hyper parodies of like masculinity and femininity.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I didn't grow up in West Virginia, and but like I don't really remember camo being as popular as it is now. Like, it's just like the last 5 years, maybe with like Duck Dynasty or like Nashville. Like these kinds of memes of like a monster truck. It's not to say that rednecks don't drive awesome trucks, because they do, or that these notions of masculinity are new, but this kind of parody of it seems like I didn't see it earlier in my life.
I think that there is a cyclical element to that, because I think when they're in these times of metaphysical crisis where meaning is uncertain, often the narrative of heroism, which is, I think, so tied into particular notions of masculinity, becomes kind of comes to the cultural forefront. And we saw this before. So in the late 19th century, and then again in the 20s, someone like Gabriele D'Annunzio, who I've argued in previous pieces, he's a sidebar poet who basically poet, celebrity, society journalist who was famous for like womenizing and interior decorating, and then somehow got into politics and accidentally became a dictator of a small state, and it went really badly. That's the short version. And yeah, I won't say more about that. But one of the things that D'Annunzio sort of did in the way that he was able to get so many people behind him and basically propel him from this sort of celebrity to politics was he appealed to this masculinity, and it was a heroic masculinity. It was like the ancient Romans would have done this, and they would have been men, and out of the sea of blood the roses will bloom. And a lot of these sort of figures, or even Mussolini as well, will sort of tie their attempts to power, or their attempts to get power, into sort of stoking this like actionable masculinity.
Arkin, actually, Bill Arkin, who wrote Top Secret America, when he left Gawker, he wrote up newsletters like that he has for people who follow his work, and he said he referred to an article that didn't, criticized his idea that like everything's becoming like ISIS, meaning to say like on the internet, like the way in which we interact, our political memes, our sort of identities, and our struggles. Have a kind of the same quality as like the way ISIS sort of works together. Like newsrooms become like kind of like ISIS, or it's all reductive. We're not really, we're talking to each other in 140 characters. We have these kind of very binary sort of sensibilities of good and bad, and we're all on some romantic quest.
Well, so can I just to bring in everybody? So I think that's incredibly interesting, and it points to the way form seems to be lending itself to certain political frameworks more than others. So you are seeing, Kek and Pepe, and that stuff really, really taking off, and then a sort of mainstream liberal hunkering down, as you say, into sort of an ideology of truth. And there doesn't seem to be a very successful left intervention in the same way there has been with the alt-right in this sort of myth-making. And I'm curious whether both of you can speak to why that might be, or the conditions that might have meant this sort of narrative meme form has lent itself so well to neo-fascism and not so well to a more radical left.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about that privately, and I think that there are various answers that you can offer up. One is that fascism or far right ideology isn't too far removed from the ways that a bully is mean to you in school. You can be made fun of in school because your skin is too dark, or you're too fat, or you're too gay, or something like that. And that, often when you see these and I'm in a lot of like alt-right meme groups on Facebook just to observe, I promise. But I mean, it's really not too far removed from that basic, just sort of the ways that kids bully each other if they deviate too far from the norm, which is white supremacist, hetero, patriarchal. I mean, it's the American story. So I think that's part of it. It's just easier to build off of that culture than it is to present an alternative that has to not only justify itself by appearing as a coherent and believable and inspiring narrative, but also has to constantly be in struggle against this dominant narrative. So I mean, that would be one guess that I have to that question. And to go back to identities being religious in certain ways, religious in terms of giving somebody meaning to their lives. I think one of the reasons that the mainstream media one of the reasons the mainstream media I fail to understand the fake news crisis was that people had a demand for fake news, and this is something Rob Horning writes a lot about. There was a demand for ideologically slanted news and fake news because it affirmed something within them, and by sharing it on Facebook or other social media platforms, there's this group consensus and group affirmation and formation. And if you talk about these identities as religious things, then the sharing and dissemination of fake news is a sort of ritual. And I'm sure a lot of people are aware that they're sharing stuff that is maybe shady or coming from a suspect source. But I think for a lot of people that doesn't really matter, because this fake news confirms something to them. It confirms a narrative. And by sharing it, a community is formed around these narratives. So I think that looking at this identity formation as a religious thing is really interesting, because then you understand fake news as part of this religious ritual.
I think that's a very good point about ritual. And I don't know how many of you know the work of James W. Carey. He was a really well-known cultural studies theorist, but wrote a very famous article called The Ritual versus Transmission View in Communication that completely addresses that. I think it's very true that journalists tend to think of information as transmitting knowledge, but another function of news is the ritual formation, where people express their solidarity with a group. And I think you can't really understand fake news unless you understand that ritual aspect. But I want to go back to something a little different in your question. I don't know why the right has been stronger in reaction to these events than the left. I don't know the answer to that. But I want to identify for you a wrong turn that I think political journalists in the mainstream press made a long time ago, maybe 20, 25 years ago. Nobody knows exactly when it happened. Nobody knows exactly why it happened. But the political press, the people who are part of a sort of a tribe that today Chuck Todd is a representative of, they began to look at politics and citizens and voters through the eyes of the professional class of people who were charged with manipulating those people. If you've ever read Max Weber's Politics as a Vocation, he distinguishes in that very famous essay between people who live for politics, meaning they want to get something done. They're activists. They have something they want to achieve. They want to correct the world. Those are people who live for politics. And then there's people who live off politics. The people who live off politics are professionals. It's their business. It's their industry. It's how they make their living. And at some point, our political journalists in the mainstream press began to look at the people out there, the voters, the public, the readers, the listeners, through the lens of the professional political class who were in charge of winning elections and putting together coalitions and the pollsters, the handlers, so that when you hear even today on MSNBC or CNN, somebody introduced as Democratic strategist crystal ball, you know the kind of person I mean? That's the turn I'm talking about. Like, what is a strategist? What does that person do? Do we don't even know what a strategist is really? We are introduced to these people, and they're introduced to us as knowledgeable people in politics. But what is their knowledge? Their knowledge is looking at the rest of us as objects to be manipulated, right? So when you hear on a typical television roundtable, Natasha, how is this going to affect white working class voters? How do you think this will play with the white working class voters? That question, which is totally familiar, it's something that happens like 100 times a week, right? That is expressing this view that I'm talking about. It's looking at people as objects to be manipulated. It's identifying, asking the audience to identify with the people who are in charge of influencing those people. So to get back to your question, somehow, if you are an actual white working class voter and you're sitting there in your living room and you're listening to the television set say to you, how do you think this will affect white working class voters? Right? And you are one. You're not going to identify with the people who are in charge of manipulating you. So somehow the right wing has reacted to their rage at that form of address better than the left wing has. And I think somehow in that wrong turn where journalists began, the news began to identify with the people who are in charge of manipulating us as objects, that if we could go back to that moment, we would understand something about what happened in 2016. But it's hard to go back to that moment because most of the people who are the products of it weren't around then. They weren't around for the wrong turn. They are the product of the wrong turn, but they weren't there when it was taken. So I don't know. But most people listening to that kind of fractured, distended dialogue don't identify with it. And the rage that accumulates from that was a huge factor in 2016. That's my belief.
Jump in real quick. I think it's also important to define what we mean when we say the left wasn't able to seize on that frustration or that infantilization through the media. I think if we're saying that the left is liberals in media, I think structurally it's very difficult for them to take advantage of that or to reach out to that voter because it's a professionalized class that is operating within a media structure that that can't really call for genuine, I think, leftist goals. For example, massive redistribution of wealth or reparations. These are things that, when I think of the left, are core goals. But if we're referring to the left as in the liberal
But
left,
I think that's the problem, right? The left in a mainstream gets called the liberal left, but that's not a left.
right? Yeah,
Like
I remember reading this article on The Hill, and it's a Chuck Schumer, the new hero of the left.
Right, madness.
And I mean, what? So what is the and so these definitions of ideological poles? If it's in the context of the mainstream media, I think one of y'all brought this up when we were talking earlier. It's pageantry, it's theater. It's this fake left and a fake right that is happening within this capitalist industry. So I think structurally, it's going to be difficult for it to deviate from this professionalization that alienates the white working class and other people who I think structurally the media sees as you were saying, the media sees themselves as aligned and working in the interests of the people who manipulate the majority of the population. It's not working in service, in their service.
As well, I want to open up to you guys in 1 second. So I'm just going to ask one more question that hopefully you guys can all sort of spitball answer. This is the fire round. Fire round. It's different. It's different. Lightning's fake news. But essentially, what is at stake, really? In a moment of post-truth. And I think people have responded to this different ways. So the Washington Post says, democracy dies in darkness, and that their truth is very metal, and that their truth is sort of the bastion against that. So they're sort of we need to save the truth. And then others are saying, no, there's this aperture, there's this interesting moment of conflict in post-truth. So I'm curious what you guys think is at stake and what could be interesting interventions.
Really quickly, I actually do believe democracy dies in darkness. Actually, and I'll tell you, I do think that the consensus of what our political regime is, what are the ground rules, the rule of law. It's so easy to tear shit down. It's really hard to build it. And I think that there are actually real people who need real solutions to criminal justice, to political economy, that in the midst of all this discussion, we have to always bring it back down to. This is a question of agency for me. I think that what the Washington Post and the New York Times are expressing are the same things. I hate to say this, somebody might punch me afterwards, but whatever. Like, are the same kinds of sensibilities that people in West Virginia are feeling when, you know, they're not covered at all because there's no local press, because that's been in decline. I mean, the newspapers have been in decline since before the internet, right? So broadcast media is now facing what they faced. And so this is like about, you know, at the end of the day, whether or not we can feed our kids, whether we can educate our children, whether we can form societies that reflect our values. And there's going to be conflict in that too. Post-Yugoslavia Tito, the rise of the demagogues. I will take a watered-down, mediocre, wheeling-dealing liberal democracy over a regime of demagogues in a heartbeat.
Guys, do you have a... Yes, that. Very good.
Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want me to go?
I thought we were going to go.
Okay. So what's at stake? I think fundamentally speaking, what's at stake kind of in navigating and negotiating a post-truth landscape is essentially at its core, like every single facet of what it means to be human. Like I don't think that's an overstatement. I think fundamentally speaking, who we are as people is so predicated upon like the fundamental question of like, is there an ontological truth? It's not just a kind of question to be debated in university lecture halls. It's not just a question that we can debate here. Fundamentally, it's a question that affects who we are, how we interact with one another, how we interface online, how we interface with one another, and like how we exist in the world and the narratives we tell about ourselves. I think, and I'm with sort of theorists like Paul Ricoeur on this. There is no such, or Clifford Geertz or what have you. There's no such thing as like a human nature outside of the cultural network that we're in. And if those stories, all of those stories collectively break down, or we don't trust them, or we are coming up with new stories which are themselves rooted, like the apocalyptic, it's all gone wrong, there is no truth, story is itself a story. Whatever we engage with as people, that is going to have like a knock-on effect on everything from like how I'm sitting in this chair to like what I eat for dinner to how I talk to you. I really do think that like the question of post-truth is an all-encompassing one, personally.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, and not to sound trite, but I guess what is most at stake in this post-truth moment is what is always at stake, which is the future. There was nothing inevitable about the media as it exists today. It formed under certain material conditions. It is changing and it will change, which also means that the narratives that we tell about ourselves and each other, will continue to change. And I just think back to a conversation I had with a friend of mine who has been incarcerated since he was 19. He's in his 40s now. He was swept up in the crack cocaine scares of the 80s in Detroit, and we talked about fake news, and he had an interesting perspective. He said, fake news is media outlets relying on government sources and government statistics and government official narratives to tell stories about people like me. Fake news is, attempts to criminalize people like me. Fake news is narratives that ignore the conditions under which people like me, he's a black guy from the inner city of Detroit. They ignore the conditions in which we are born and the history that we come from. That is fake news. So that was, it made me consider, there's this tension between wanting to defend the mainstream media from Trump and from other would-be authoritarians who want to exert personal influence on, mass narrative making. So there's a tension between wanting to defend those institutions, but then also wanting to criticize them and having an awareness of the narratives that these institutions have always propped up, which in this country are fundamentally white supremacists. They're in the interest of the ruling class, and they're not things that shouldn't change. I mean, they should change. So that tension is just something I think about a lot. And as far as what's at stake, it's the same thing that's always been at stake.
I think it's really important for everybody here to understand that there is an organized movement to discredit the mainstream press in this country. And it's very related to the attack on science and evidence-based reasoning. And that's related to the attack on government functions like the Congressional Budget Office and civil servants and professionals in government whose job it is to tell policymakers like what's actually going on. And all of these things are part of the same movement. What's common to all of the things under attack is not truth. I don't find post-truth a very useful category. I don't talk that much about truth myself. But what all of those disciplines have in common is that they're dedicated to verification. Verification is, did that really happen? And people who go into journalism, the people who go into journalism for the best reasons, they're people who are drawn in by that question. Did that really happen? Can we show that it happened? And one of the most potent and disturbing things going on in our world now is something I would call verification in reverse. So verification is taking something that might be true and trying to nail it down, trying to find evidence, trying to find documents, doing interviews, going to the source. Right? That's verification. Verification in reverse is taking something that's been nailed down and introducing doubt about it, which then releases a lot of energy and fury and controversy and crisis, and then fueling a political movement with that energy. And verification in reverse is literally the way Donald Trump came to power. That's how he started his life as a political figure, with the birther movement, where he took something that was as nailed down as it can be in our culture. Was Barack Obama born in the United States? Here's the birth certificate. In journalism, you can't get any more verified than that. That's like the end of the road. That's it. It's over. The question has been settled. He took something that was verified and he introduced doubt about it, which released energy. He used that energy to power his candidacy. So I don't know about truth. Truth is like, that's a problem. But the people dedicated to verification are under attack right now as we sit here today. And I think those people deserve defense.
And thank you all very much. So I think we have about 10, 15 minutes. Can I ask if anyone wants to ask things? I actually can't see you like at all, but I think me.
Hands? Hands, I see hands. If I could ask that you keep the question really, really short. We're going to see how many we can do in a few minutes. So if you can hand the microphone over, because there's pizza coming really soon.
Once again, thank you all very much for your everything today. Really appreciate it. My question is, ultimately, there's a through line that goes between all of your positions, and it seems that, Tara, even though you say that you're not really that concerned about belief, that the notion of belief actually does bind all of these things together. It binds together how we think about verification. It binds together how we think about what truth is. It binds together about how we signal where we stand within our communities. All of these elements seem to have belief and value in common. And so from an epistemological standpoint and a philosophical standpoint, mightn't it do us good to think about where belief originates and what gives us that sense of co-belief within communities, and how we can more readily foster that from the position, as Jay noted early on, from the position of mainstream journalistic standards, to get back into that theorizing position again, to try to devise strategies to dig down there again.
So I just want to start by when I want to just clarify earlier. When I said I'm not interested in belief, what I meant purely is sort of like belief in the sort of most simplistic sense of like I believe X. I think what you touched on in your question, what I absolutely strongly subscribe to, is that belief, as in this in sort of the wider sense, is a lot more than holding a propositional idea. It is deeply rooted. It's a social phenomenon. It's rooted in identity. It's rooted in how we relate to each other. It's rooted in performance and ritual, which I thought was a really apt term. And I think insofar as we're talking about belief, I absolutely agree with you that sort of we are all starting from a question, from the standpoint that there is something about engaging with truth that transcends a, let's say, rational apprehension of a propositional fact. It is not disembodied. It is not purely theoretical, given the title of this conference. It is something kind of rich and personal and embodied and social, and to this extent religious. So I do think that insofar as that is belief, then I absolutely agree it is about this sort of wider and more dynamic definition of belief than mere sort of rational apprehension.
More questions? Yeah.
I just want to. I mean, one would think. I mean, this question that you asked actually reminds me of Plato. This sort of notion. I don't know. I know I don't know anything. I mean, one would think that in this post-truth sort of sensibility, that the wisest sort of strategy would be to admit that one doesn't know, and at the same time as knowing that, it's sort of like eros or love. You can know that love is BS or think that, right? I'm not saying it is. But you still find yourself falling in love with people. Like even in the midst of knowing, one is still called to believe in things, to be human, and to enact that. So. I don't think it's like a completely discomforting or destabilizing place. Maybe that's the beginning of the wisdom tradition.
I want to thank you guys for speaking today, and I want to change the subject a little bit. As you were speaking, I noticed that there's a premium set on truth and valuing that, what is real and what isn't real, and what can we use through the means of research journalism to prove what is real. And in terms of the Trump presidency and how he became president, the people who voted for him, I grew up in Iowa. A large percentage of my friends voted for him, and an equally large percentage of my friends voted for Hillary Clinton. So it was half and half. I grew up with those two sets of people groups. And I often wonder about the ways that journalists have been covering the Trump supporters after the election. They were very valid. As an Asian American, I could say that there were some very valid reasons that certain people groups in Iowa voted for Donald Trump. And I watch the news and I read the news and I read how they covered some of his voters, and they are often through the perspective of intellectualism. Like, they made a dumb move, there was no rational reason that they should vote for him in that manner. There's also some journalism that are a little bit more honest in terms of in covering Iowans, as in their motivation to vote the way that they did. I often find that in journalism, people use their language of intellectualism to describe certain populations in Iowa or Trump voters who don't necessarily ascribe to that high level of intellectualism in justifying why they vote the way they do or why they believe the way that they do. I'm not saying that truth isn't important. I'm not saying that intellectualism isn't important. I'm just asking that, is there a way to cover people who aren't in your bubble or who think like you in a way that's dignified, but also sheds light as to who they are as people and why they do the things that they do in a language that can represent them if it's not in the language of intellectualism?
Well, I think you're totally right that the coverage of Trump supporters was, and I think most people agree that the coverage just wasn't good. It was taking place from this removed professional class perspective that intellectualized and condescended to these people, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of which is so much media being concentrated in New York City and other coastal places that aren't rooted in these communities, and this is something that people have talked about. But I also think that when you report on people who believe certain things or are captivated by certain aspects of a presidential campaign, and you're reporting the truth about that, it's not necessarily going to be something that is comforting for these people. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I can understand why a lot of these people who voted for Trump and who had an affinity with his agenda feel as if they were condescended to and were that coverage of them wasn't fair during the election, and resorted to simplistic narratives of racism or these other things. However, I don't think that the role of journalists or the media is to make these people feel comfortable with their decisions, and if the truth is going to be uncomfortable for them, well, then they're just going to continue to feel uncomfortable. So I mean, there's a limit, I think, to what journalists can do when they're reporting on people. They can be honest and they can do it from a place of being rooted in a community. That doesn't guarantee that it won't piss the people off that a journalist is covering.
You could do another question. Hands up. Let's get somebody over here.
Just responding to something that Jay said, I think that also we have to admit that the media also created Trump. I mean, Trump, and you had mentioned actually before the panel, you talked about just the money that the channels make off of Trump. I mean, he's great for ratings if you hate him or you love him or whatever. Obviously, you can't, the race issue has to be sort of met squarely about white working class voters. I mean, where are the journalists covering, black working class voters? Okay, because they're there and they're suffering too. And I think that a lot of times, I think about how the press also covers, for example, police violence and the racial stereotypes. I mean, it's really there is a component of that is also that kind of parody and caricaturing that also, it's interesting the sympathy that the white working class voters get. And I know plenty of people who voted for Trump too. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Tennessee and West Virginia. So I get it, it's a tough conversation, but race has to be addressed straight on.
So one of the common threads in this conversation, especially early on, was this idea of newness. So new forms of technology in a post-mass media age that enable new forms of connectivity, new forms of sharing, both vertical and horizontal. I'm wondering if part of that interrogation of what's new and trying to put that in historical context means that maybe we should think about interrogating the idea that news, right, discursively as a thing that is produced by journalistic institutions and enterprises needs to be rethought. So in other words, do we need to, if we're going to think about how truth gets ascertained, developed, and circulated and struggled for, is news the best term or best idea to describe what journalistic processes should be putting out?
Can you hear me? Okay. Is news itself, the way conventionally defined, part of the problem? I think it might be. And I'm trying to help a site in the Netherlands called The Correspondent expand to the United States. They have a very different model for how they operate. First of all, they're completely member funded. They have 56,000 members who pay $63 a year to support this site. And therefore they have no sponsors, no advertisers, no billionaires. Everything is funded by the members. And because the members fund it, they don't need to chase traffic. They don't need to target you. They don't need to track you. And they don't need to produce a certain amount of content. And so one of their editorial principles is not the weather, but the climate. So they don't even try to produce something on what's news today. They're always looking for underlying patterns, things that actually signify for a longer period of time than 24 hours or 48 or this week. And they're not dedicated to what happened today. They're dedicated to what's happening in society. And just to give you a sense of how different they are, after operating for a couple of years, their readers, their users, their members started to complain. They said, "You're producing too much stuff. We can't keep up." And this is creating anxiety. And so in response, what they did was make less news. And the readers were more satisfied because they could keep up. And they had the same number of writers, but they produced fewer pieces, so each piece could take longer, which meant that each piece was better and included more information, more reporting, more depth, and everybody was satisfied. And the only problem with that system is if you need traffic and you have advertisers and you need to generate more users every day. So because they have a different economy where readers are paying directly for the service, they don't have to capture attention. They're not selling your attention. They're not commoditizing eyeballs. They have a different definition of news. News is not what's happening today. It's not the weather. It's the climate. So maybe we need to rebuild the whole industry of news from the ground up. That's why I'm involved with this site called The Correspondent. They're going to launch in the US in 2018, The Correspondent. And I think it's solutions like that that go right down to the very economy of news that may be necessary now.
The bad news, I have to interrupt the panel. The good news is we have 2 more keynotes kind of on this topic tomorrow. I hope you come out to that. The real news is that we have a bunch of pizzas, so everybody give a big round of applause to the panel. Let's get some pizza.